Hello, welcome back to the channel. I have here Carl Jung psychological types as well as my napkin notes. And for those of you who don't know, napkin notes are when the thought and the feeling seize upon you and you know you got to get them down as they are, when they are, because there's no revisiting what is a temporary state anyway, right? There's no stepping into the same river twice, and there's no real accounting for that even. So you take them down wherever it needs to go, whether that's post-it notes or napkins or any other things. In which case, I'm thinking poets, writers, philosophers, thinkers, certain types of people, back to psychological types itself, that certain type of people will understand what a napkin note is. Other people might think, oh, that's crazy. Oh, that's silly. Oh, that's quirky. Or they might think, oh, that's stupid. Oh, why not use your phone? Why not use a notepad? Why not use any number of things, right? So there is a wide variation of not just how thought and feeling occurs in individuals, but the depth to which they're sought out, created, and felt. And the interesting thing about psychological types here, which is basically the title of the video, is that the most misunderstood concept in modern human existence is introversion and extroversion, what they mean, and the fact that they are night and day differences in a individual human being. So the idea that there was some general humanity where everyone thinks and feels and senses the world in the same way, that everyone was capable of the same thoughts and feelings, the idea that everyone's just sort of a blank slate of a biological husk of a body that didn't evolve, but is just spurred out on the moment and then can be shaped in whichever way anyone assumes they can project their assumptions onto this being. So even coming back to revisit this, I didn't even realize how he prefaced the book. So in reading through it, he doesn't even get into sensing, feeling, intuitive types, those types of things. He himself focuses on the extroverted introverted divide. And it's profound in that it's almost like the concept of synchronicity itself. Like, is a scientist, is someone who's working out a methodology after working with thousands of individuals over time and then seeing how these patterns play out, right? That what Jung was doing was he was trying to best elaborate on what these patterns were and how they played out. But like synchronicity, it's almost a way of saying nothing. It's so, like, you say, what is synchronicity? And you go, well, it's an idea to describe a phenomenon. And the phenomenon is that there is no explanation. It's simply synchronous. What does that mean? Well, for a thinker or an artist, it means being struck by the muse. It means needing to take some napkin notes. It means any number of experiences that is completely subjective and personal to the individual in question. You know, Actually, to give you an example, I'm reminded of the movie Pulp Fiction. Two characters experience the same life or death situation in which these gangsters are shot at, and every single bullet misses them at point blank range. So one of them perceives it as a freak occurrence. The other one has a revelation and a personality change that he interprets as the will of God. So you see two different ways that two individuals could react to the same situation. Arguably, you could see by their value system and the way they even talk that Vincent Vega and Jules Verne, I don't remember his last name, but these two characters are two different personality types. One is introverted and one is extroverted. And I'm going to go on ahead and begin this with discussing reading the preface here, because he does set the premise, and I'm going to examine what this, like I said, for like synchronicity, this introduction reads as synchronous in the sense that it's describing a phenomenon, but it almost says nothing about the phenomenon. And then you can question why. And it's no different than Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, because the very implication carried perception and conception shattering elements in it because the whole presumption of a Christian Western worldview as modeled to be in stasis for thousands of years was seen to be insufficient to actually contain the inevitable discoveries and uncoveries of and by and from human consciousness. You can see it in people and phenomenon like even the idea of just how we behave and how we're supposed to behave within society or culture. It's all based on acting, being taught how to act. And if anyone acts out of the norm, they're immediately suspect, right? And then because we know that people are dangerous, and the whole fear of madness is clearly that culture as a larger entity is very much afraid of what comes out of an individual, let alone a group's psyche, right? So, as Jung would point out, the individual is the only carrier of psyche. The group is a non-existent phenomenon, right? That there's no actual mind to it. There's no interconnected parts. There are a bunch of individual islands stitched together, right? But I'm going to go ahead and start reading here. And already we're going to be faced with the night and day differences of introversion and extroversion. And to clarify up front, the common misconception, the common definition is that introversion means you recharge your battery, your social batteries, the all vague terms, right? All generic, right? Because, the case with American culture is you take anything intellectual, dumb it down enough, and then you can sell it on the American market. But in this case, with Jung's typology, he's spelling it out without saying it. So it begins, in my practical medical work with nervous patients, I have long been struck by the fact that besides the many individual differences in human psychology, there are also typical differences. Two types especially become clear to me. I have termed them the introverted and the extroverted types. So already that's section one. He's saying these are the two extreme cases. When we consider the course of human life, we see how the fate of one individual is determined more by the objects of his interest, right, what they so-called choose, while in another it is determined more by his own inner self, by the subject, again, what they so-called choose. Since we all swerve rather more towards one side or the other, introversion or extroversion, ambiversion isn't real. It's nonsense. We naturally tend to understand everything in terms of our own type, right? So what I said earlier, a lot of times you can see miscommunications in types that a dumb person will often think a smart person is dumb, or no different than how someone might judge someone who's perceived to have a condition like autism, whatever these kinds of things are, which are arguably extreme cases of introversion, maybe. I don't know if anyone's done the work on this. I haven't looked into that depth inside of it myself, but I'm just putting out what I've found here and what can be built off of it. So these miscommunications in types, one person going, wow, that's stupid, or I don't understand. And it's like they don't understand the creative process. They don't understand what these sidetracks and diversions are. They don't understand what a change in habit entails. They don't understand that one's needs might change because everything in human life is taught as the value of habit and repetition, as if one could, even after a watering hole becomes poisoned and dries up and dries out, that as if one could go there and apply the same fishing and drinking techniques, and that it would somehow have the same effect as once upon a time when this well had crystal clear water in it, right? Times change. The environment changes by us and our technology. So, and all that is understood through our own type is what Jung is understanding. So the tendency is towards projection. Projection of the truth? No, projection of a primate who thinks its view and perception is reality. So I mentioned the circumstance at once in order to avoid possible misunderstandings. It will be apparent that it is one which considerably aggravates the difficulty of a general description of types. I must presume unduly upon the goodwill of the reader if I may hope to be rightly understood. So he's saying, give me a chance here. Let me lay the groundwork. It would be relatively simple if every reader knew to which category he belonged, but it is often very difficult to find out whether a person belongs to one type or the other. It's not. Especially in regard to oneself. In respect to one's own personality, one's judgment is, as a rule, extraordinarily clouded. Yes, he's saying the individual is clouded by their own thoughts, feelings, projections, in a world where people argue over these very things on a daily basis. I'm not saying they're arguing over this particular thing I'm reading. I just mean generally, people argue over everything. He goes on, this subjective clouding of judgment is particularly common because in every pronounced type there is a special tendency to compensate the one-sidedness of that type, a tendency which is biologically purposive since it strives constantly to maintain the psychic equilibrium. Wow, that's a complicated way to not say anything, or to say here's a phenomenon, but what does it mean? Uh, the idea that you could maintain psychic equilibrium is quite the assumption when we see uh, tribal and other people kind of have their own assumptions and ways of doing things as is. So he's saying it strives constantly to maintain the psychic equilibrium, but it's who's at the expense of whose, right? That's what no one's saying here. That's what's not written anywhere in here, is that the subtle warfare of it is that arguably they're different subspecies of humanity, right? One against the other, right? That you would see like any mutation, it's a species is when a species is literally the same. And then a mutation is when a defining characteristic kind of changes the way that now subspecies does business. So if extroverts sense and see the world with external sight and the values judged thereby, I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's quite the assumption to assume that there is a desire for psychic equilibrium versus a game of power at play, a fight. The compensation gives rise to secondary characteristics or secondary types, right? This is the sensory, the intuitive, the so on and so forth, which present a picture that is extremely difficult to interpret, so difficult that one is inclined to deny the existence of types altogether and to believe only in individual differences, right? Or that it's environment or circumstance, when typology is so ancient that you can characterize historical figures and their very thought processes thereby. More so, what rounding out, I've been talking about McKenna the last few days, Terence McKenna specifically, and it's not that any one of his, like any thinker, it's not about that any one of their ideas is the absolute and final word of God. It's the ideas themselves. It's questioning how could something be true and so on and so forth. So in his prediction of the future and what he saw was coming, and basically the perennial liberal freak out at the end of history, is that existing in this pre-apocalyptic post-historical state, is that he saw that it would become increasingly chaotic and likely madness, right? And that the end result of this would be that humanity would become not invisible to itself, but it would become incomprehensible to itself. And I think that was true of his time because there wasn't enough data and self-given information, and there weren't enough case studies. Now the data has been collected and correlated by everyone, but basically McKenna thought that we would not be able to understand ourselves. And now I think with constant daily examples being produced on a regular basis of what the extroverted sensory-oriented world of inauthenticity or acting, right, which is the most sincere art of our culture, right, the most sincere expression of an inauthentic culture uh, uh, is sincerity in the acts engaged therein. It's an artistic flair on what is otherwise feeding and being fed upon. So I'm positing it as an evolutionary arms race. More so, it's not understood for good reason because, like any new scientific theory or information, it's fought tooth and nail by everyone who already believes the values and understanding of the world to be final, as if the judgment has already been rendered and now we're just waiting for the end, right? You can't actually change anything, including our understanding, right? Because there's authority figures and things in place to supposedly safeguard things like psychological information, right? Trust a professional, a doctor, right? Never mind any of the questionable practices there. But even before Jung, Jung's not the first guy to pose a type theory on humanity. Like I said, there's Eastern understanding of yogi, monk, fakir, the sensor, the intuitive or the thinker, and the feeler or the monk, right? That these were different ways of life, and men engaged in them as based on their type. And before that, there's other Western thinkers and intellectuals who also posited many type theories. And then the whole thing has kind of been hidden throughout our evolution. But now that it has piled up, and I'm now stating it's the opposite of what McKenna stated. We are no longer um, not understandable to ourselves. I'd say we're all too understandable to ourselves. People are transparent, people are translucent. And it basically goes like the vibe check, because you go all the circumstances of your existence that led to these consecutive moments that is your life. And this is how you turned out. This is what you chose. This is what you did with your freedom, right? However you want to term it. And I get it, because people are limited to whatever their circumstances, birth, genetics, everything that hems people in. But this is kind of what psychological types is about. It's about these different personality types who, due to their nature, are locked into certain patterns of existence within a world that has largely been repeating these patterns, including through biological reproduction of personality types. Now, it would follow then that Jung's whole archetypes fit in by way of the preference and deference of these types to play out certain necessary roles within a tribal culture, and then a primitive herd-like tribal structure, which eventually gave way to a mass-produced herd-like and tribal structure, right? So now we find ourselves in the present day, and mankind is transparent, translucent, like Nietzsche wrote. Man is tired of man. Man is sick of himself. He's sick of other selves, arguably to the point of suicidality and pathology, and preaching everything from ceasing existence to desistance, or more of the same that we've already seen that just plays out the same every time. The idea that it can be changed, that you can change who and what a person is, whether that's through, Bernays and propaganda, whether that's through a state leveraging dictates, and whether that's through even individual philosophers and thinkers who are always going, geez, I have these ideas, this is the way it is. And then very rarely do they go, what are the effects of this? And how do people really see me? Because as Jung just said, right, most people are caught up in their own world too much to see that how variable and different everyone else's is. The idea that we've lived even on the same planet and seen the same things, even that is a mistaken notion. But I'm going to keep reading. Section 4. I must emphasize this difficulty in order to justify certain peculiarities in my presentation. It might seem as if the simplest way would be to describe two concrete cases and to dissect them side by side, but everyone possesses both mechanisms, extroversion as well as introversion, and only the relative predominance of one or the other determines the type. Hence, in order to throw the picture into the necessary relief, one would have to retouch it rather vigorously. So he's saying again, with how locked in everyone is to their predominant mechanism, that it would require a questioning of first principles. And this would amount to a more or less pious fraud. Moreover, the psychological reactions of a human being are so complicated that my powers of description, oh, he's letting himself off the hook here, that my powers of description would hardly suffice to draw an absolutely correct picture. Well, is it genius? Thank you for letting us keep our dignity, Jung, right? Thanks for not talking down to us. From sheer necessity, therefore, I must confine myself to a presentation of principles which I have abstracted from a wealth of facts observed in many different individuals. In this, there is no question of a deductio a priori. As it might appear, it is rather a deductive presentation of empirically gained insights. So kind of what I said earlier is that he noticed the patterns after working with thousands of people over the span of his career, right? It wasn't a guess, there's a methodology, and that's what he's describing as well. These insights will, I hope, help to clarify a dilemma which, not only in analytical psychology, but in other branches of science as well, and especially in the personal relations of human beings with one another, has led and still continues to lead misunderstanding and discord. For they explain how the existence of two distinct types is actually a fact that has long been known, a fact that in one form or another has struck the observer of a human nature or dawned upon the brooding reflection of the thinker, presenting itself up to Goethe's intuition, for instance, as the all-embracing principle of systole and diastole. The names and concepts by negation and abnegation. The names and concepts by which the mechanisms of extroversion and introversions have been grasped are extremely varied, and each of them is adapted to the standpoint of the observer in question, right? So it's like, again, if you're well fed, chances are you're not going to blow the whistle. Yeah, that's another way of putting it. But despite the diversity of the formulations, the fundamental idea common to them all constantly shines through. In one case, an outward movement of interest toward the object, and in the other, a movement of interest away from the object to the subject and his own psychological processes. So I'm going to repeat that again up front. Here's the differences: extrovert and introvert, completely different mental lives. In one case, an outward movement of interest towards the object, in the other case, a movement of interest away from the object to the subject and his own psychological processes. In the first case, the object works like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject, right? It's like a primitive, superstitious, like, oh, this contains the power. We're going to, bow down and worship it. It determines, and if you get enough people to do that, you now have an idol or a set of values. I don't mean to simplify it by saying it's superstitious and religious. It is. It determines the subject to a large extent and even alienates him from himself, right? Because he's putting the importance outside of himself. Now, what if everyone outside of himself also disagrees with what he values? Do you begin to see the extrovert's problem, right? He's up against everyone and everything in the world because he looks to the world and wants to see permanent values therein. But as we can see, that's not how reality works. So, in the first case, the object, okay. And in the second case, it determines the subject to a large extent and even alienates him from himself. So that's the extroversion case. His qualities may become so transformed by assimilation to the object that one might think it possessed some higher and decisive significance for him, right? And that's that religious tendency, an object of worship. And if people agree on what the objects of worship are, then you can build a culture around whatever that is. It could be a craven idol. It can be money, it can be group identity, it can be anything. A special purpose of life or fate that he should abandon himself wholly to the object, right? Because that's what you're instantiating in the world. But then everyone else looks to the object and goes, well, we disagree anyway. Or that statue gets toppled, right? So there's all sorts of issues at play here. So where were we at? But in the second case, the subject is and remains the center of every interest. They like themselves more than the world. These are the happy ones. They've long been persecuted. It looks, one might say, as though all the life energy were ultimately seeking the subject, and thus continually prevented the object from exercising any overpowering influence, right? So it's almost like understanding that objects like hoarding acorns is a weird obsession, actually, in a certain sense. It is though the energy were flowing away from the object and the subject were a magnet drawing the object to itself. So unless you're an animal, you're going to have a hard time identifying yourself with acorns. I guess if you're an animal, then you see yourself as indifferentiable from the object. You've melded your identity with it. Sight becomes synonymous with vision, what you're seeing, a projected reality upon which I've said, it seems to me that the hallucination has to be considered real or the person won't act, which sort of explains why in psychosis people act crazy or not normal because they've lost that regulating mechanism. Going on where we, as though the energy were flowing away from the object. Okay, right. So it's basically like the introvert is almost closer to a vampire who sucks the value out of it. So this is, from the perspective of the evolutionary arms race, it is a fight over values. 5. It is not easy to give a clear and intelligible description of this two-way relationship to the object without running the risk of paradoxical formulations, which would create more confusion than clarity. Right? Because the whole thing, if the whole thing's locked in place, if it's in stasis, no different than a beehive, or any other animal organization where people kind of find their place within the established structure and order of the world, ... right? But in general, one could say that the introverted standpoint is one which sets the ego and the subjective psychological process above the object and the objective process, right? Who's the one ascribing the value? If you're not so desperate as needing to have meaning explained or ascribed to you or for you. You learn to do it yourself. That's the whole point about being a thinking animal. Um, right? You're not just taking someone else's word for it. What do we know about people? They're unreliable. They're misunderstood. They misunderstand themselves and one another. The average person is not a pretty picture. And this is what I was saying when I said the biggest takeaway here is that it's not, for a moment, we became unrecognizable to ourselves. Now it seems to me that people are very aware of what they are and the differences between them and other people, that's becoming increasingly clear to some savvy extroverts, probably intuitive types, right? Because if they're sensory oriented, they're not doing that more abstracted internal valuation and devaluation and revaluation. So there does seem to be, because everything's predicated on a certain reality of seeing how everything is locked in. These are the pragmatists, the utilitarians, a lot of judges, a lot of censors, a lot of extrovert censors. Basically the ideal model for the factorial society was some of these characters, right? Which are just two or three types out of what MBTI rounded out to 16, and Jung has, thereabouts as well. But I'm going to keep going. Paradoxical, okay, in general, let's see the introverted standpoint. So this attitude, therefore, gives a subject a higher value than the object, right? Because you'd have to devalue yourself before an object to say that the value of the object is more valuable than your existence, right? To put the object over you, you would have to borderline worship it. And then to get out from underneath the object's power that you projected on it, you would have to go inward and look at it. And then you would need, in the case of Jung, like his whole premise of therapy was, the psychologist served as a point of transference for you to recognize your own fucked up projection of whatever unreality or pathology you were really looking at. Like Terence McKenna talks about with psychedelics, it's waking up to who and what you are and then being largely alarmed or traumatized thereby in some sense, because that's the kind of thing that requires, that's usually the cost of self-knowledge, as Jung also wrote once upon a time. So he's saying the attitude therefore gives the subject a higher value than the object, and the object accordingly has a lower value. Right, because the object can be rebuilt, rediscovered. It's the object isn't the source of the value. The source of the value was the valuing standpoint, was the culture, the language, how we arrived at that conclusion, these kinds of things, right? That has been a long, hard, deadly, and fatalistic process. It is the object, and the object accordingly has lower value. It is of secondary importance. Indeed, sometimes the object represents no more than an outward token of a subjective content, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's decoration, if anything, like a shiny bead or something simple like that. The embodiment of an idea, the idea being the essential thing. If it is the embodiment of a feeling, then again, the feeling is the main thing and not the object in its own right. The extroverted standpoint, on the contrary, subordinates the subject to the object, so that the object has the higher value, even if it's an abstract value created by someone else. In this case, the subject is of secondary importance. It is clear that the psychology resulting from these contrary standpoints, right, and Jung says it right here, introversion and extroversion are contrary. They're not just a spectrum. It's not a simple line. They're contrarian standpoints. Must be classed as two totally different orientations. Two different orientations, that's a mutation. This is what I said earlier, that, or at least in the last video on Wrap Up Thoughts and McKenna, right, that the mutation in humanity, the mutation to consciousness, that actually already happened. There's this idea that we're waiting for some future enlightenment, when in reality the slow class is keeping everyone behind. And by slow class, I mean the average of civilization, the average of what the Western world created. Just management of its simple existence is its future, is its destiny. There's nowhere for it to go. There's nothing for it to do, right? It's already conquered and assimilated all outside forces. What new object in the world can it obsess on, especially if God is dead? So it is clear that the psychology resulting from these contrary, I read that, the one sees everything in terms of his own situation, the other in terms of the objective event. This is a creation of doers out of deeds, fictions from non-fictions. There's a reality, and people are sorting and extrapolating the data. Just because something works doesn't mean it's right in any sense of the word right. So moving on, number 6, these contrary attitudes are in themselves no more than correlative mechanisms, a diastolic going out and seizing of the object, and a systolic concentration and detachment of energy from the object seized. Every human being possesses both mechanisms as an expression of his natural life rhythm, a rhythm which Goethe, surely not by chance, described physiologically in terms of the heart's activity. A rhythmical alternation of both forms of psychic activity would perhaps correspond to the normal course of life. But the complicated outer conditions under which we live, see, and this is where Jung, right, like, I don't even know to the degrees that he took media culture and TV and the kind of psychedelic effects of a retribalization of the world through media. I don't know that he ever studied that or took it seriously, right? So he's kind of left, I kind of see why he leaves no conclusion, because he doesn't see where it all goes other than the understanding that these are apocalyptic times. But the complicated outer conditions under which we live and the even more complicated conditions of our individual psychic makeup seldom permit a completely undisturbed flow of psychic energy. So he's saying it's just hard to see, right? Maybe rather than assuming we know, we defer judgment. We take in more information. We study the patterns some more. We see where things went wrong in the past. Any number of self-reflective measures to understand. Outer circumstances and inner disposition frequently favor one mechanism and restrict or hinder the other. So it's like saying in an energized system, what's produced is taken at the expense of what's consumed. One mechanism will naturally predominate, and if this condition becomes in any way chronic, a type will be produced. See, this almost makes it sound like it's conditioned rather than born. I think it's born. I think it's like everything else that genetics indicates about us, right? How tall we are, all the information that garners the creation of new beings with some weird return to its mean, right? This was the established form and pattern, rather than the conditioning is what's secondary, which is what the introvert almost exists to fight against. That is, an habitual attitude toward the other can never be completely suppressed, since it is an integral part of the psychic economy. Hence, there can never be a pure type in the sense that it possesses only one mechanism with the complete atrophy of the other. Right. See, and this is where my theory on like maybe introversion relates to a severe form of autism, and the fact that what supposedly people say is that certain brains are formed differently, and this is how they diagnose ADHD even, when in reality it's the medicalization of a subspecies of humanity. Now there's a controversial topic. Um, the hypothesis of introversion and extroversion allows us, first of all, to distinguish two large groups of psychological individuals. Yet this grouping is of such a superficial and general nature that it permits no more than this very general distinction. Again, he's really letting himself. He's basically saying, I can observe the phenomenon, but I don't have enough information to make a conclusion, and good for him. Closer investigation of the individual psychologies that fall into one group or the other will at once show great differences between individuals who nevertheless belong to the same group. If, therefore, we wish to determine wherein lie the differences between individuals belonging to a definite group, we must take a further step. Experience has taught me that, in general, individuals can be distinguished not only according to the broad distinctions between introversion and extroversion, but also according to their basic psychological functions. For in the same measure as outer circumstances and inner disposition cause either introversion or extroversion to predominate, they also favor the predominance of one definite basic function in the individual. I have found from experience that the basic psychological functions, that is, functions which are genuinely as well as essentially different from the other functions, if one of these functions habitually predominates, a corresponding type results. I thereby distinguish a thinking, a feeling, a sensation, and an intuitive type. And within that, that's the yogi, monk, or fakir designation. Each of these types may moreover be either introverted and extroverted. depending on its relation to the object as we have described above, right? So if you consider the Western view from the standpoint that the ego is so immortal as to have this vague abstract called a soul that will live forever, you can see that it's an extrovertive dominated mode of thought compared to Eastern thought, even Eastern thought within, let's say, something like Russian Orthodoxy, where we do see the flavors of the Mediterranean and the Eastern and the Jewish and the Chinese and all these various cultures that contributed to more introverted oriented cultures whose expression are generally more quiet, less loud, less obnoxious. If you can basically, if you want to know what a extroverted commercial is, or if you want to know what the extroverted sensor world is, just imagine the loudest, most annoying YouTube or television personality interrupting whatever it is you're trying to watch with an even louder volume set to interrupt everything about your thoughts, your feelings, your orientation to the world and what you're doing to try to sell you whatever they're trying to sell you. That's what an extroverted sensor world looks like. The interesting thing about Carl Jung is you can go look up a talk on YouTube right now of him talking about a country like America. And what he said, if I recall correctly, verbatim, it's something like, a bit oxymoronic there, but he says something like, introverts don't stand a snowball's chance in hell. And at its best, he means they can't compete on a market of psychopaths. At its worst, he could mean the society drives them crazy at a higher rate than it does the extrovert. However, in this post-history, pre-apocalypse that we find ourselves at, when questions and values are in doubt and when things are in flux, the extroverted sensor world, which formerly was completely seemingly stable, absolutely convulses and has spasms, and things that people were trying to repress and stop from happening start happening, right? The fear dominates, paranoia dominates. Our culture, in its extroverted nature, going back through all of, the evolution of the ego through this social morass, going from acceptable collectivism as governed by a church and then a government and then commercial entities, absent religion and any real connection or feeling there to, it's like it's created a very bereft existence for people. It's the de-soulification of humanity. It's robbing the heart blind to eat well in the present at the expense of the future. There's many ways I could frame or create a metaphor here, but most introverts and intuitives have been talking about this and little else for the entire last century, because the realization at the end of history was, what else was there if we recognize we were wrong about just about everything? I think I got sidetracked from my initial point as well as the point I was trying to follow up on the interplay of introverts and extroverts within the larger civilizational process that's been playing out, with history being its violent record. And I'll come back later. The hypothesis of introversion and extroversion allows us, first of all, to distinguish two large groups of psychological individuals. Yet this grouping is of such a superficial and general nature that it permits no more than this very general distinction. Closer investigation of the individual psychologies that fall into one group or the other will at once show great differences between individuals who nevertheless belong to the same group. Right? So even within types, there's variations. There's probably everything from, the physical facts of their genetics to how that formed their minds and their perceptual processes and how they see themselves and how they see the world, independent of how the others in the world might see them, right? There's a question of who's dependent on who and for what, validation, attention, the reminder that you exist and one day you won't exist, right? These are all strange dynamics that a supposedly sentient animal has to navigate, because Jung makes it, at the end of the day, he kind of makes it sound quaint. I think it's coming up soon even, where I'm going to describe it. If therefore we wish to determine wherein lie the differences between individuals belonging to a definitive group, we must take it a step further. Experience has taught me that in general, individuals can be distinguished not only according to the broad distinction between introversion and extroversion, but also according to their basic psychological functions. For in the same measure as outer circumstances and inner disposition cause either introversion or extroversion to predominate, they also favor the predominance of one's definite basic function in the individual. So like no one's born with someone else's genetics other than whatever it is they inherited, right? So, and whether anyone knows the idea that everyone knows where that soup precisely came from is part of the absurdity because we know it came from the animals. So if we trace our lineage back far enough, it kind of becomes embarrassing, right? In my preliminary work on psychological types, I did not carry out this differentiation, but identified the thinking type with the introvert and the feeling type with the extrovert. A deeper study of the problem has shown this equation to be untenable. In order to avoid misunderstandings, I would ask the reader to bear in mind the differentiations I have developed here. Right? So again, the idea that introversion or extroversion is as simple or as even the same concept as, oh, it's how you get your battery charged, it's how you socialize. No, it's more like the fact that you're a type of personality determines how and why you, and the very value you see of socializing. Therefore, your choice in association, meaning I don't think extroverts don't understand just how many introverts are dischoosing them, not to be mean or rude, but that's kind of what history seems to indicate is introverts are just go constantly saying, oh, this can't be it. We can't stop here. This is what they're like. This is what we're like. Nuh-uh. Nope, nope, nope. They're like beatings will continue until morale improves. That was history. History had its time. The mutation of introversion sent it all in motion, it seems. Then the larger average types of sensory extroverted dominant types, got to have their day in the sun called history. They all got to worship around their objects of mutual agreement. And now that that process is played out, we're seeing that the world isn't oriented like extroverts want it to be because nothing is permanent like they want it to be. Which is the bigger confession of everything, right? Because back to the vibe check of the unique circumstances of any individual life is the genetic makeup and then their place they're born into the world. And then we see what they choose, what they gravitate towards, what they supposedly had the freedom under Christian and liberal and Western law, that these are the ascribed values and conceptions. So that you had this one unique existence and this is what you chose, or the idea that the whole idea of culture and being popular therein is to be the same as everyone else, right? That the whole vibe check of it begins to fall apart. And that's what we're witnessing. And it's going to result in more madness. So a deeper study of the problem has shown this equation to be untenable. In order to avoid misunderstandings, I would ask the reader to bear in mind the differentiation I have developed here. For the sake of clarity, which is essential in such a complicated manner, I devoted the last chapter of this book to the definition of my psychological concepts. Originally, I was going to read the specific clarifications and delineations on what he says are the extroverted type and the introverted type, the general attitudes towards consciousness, but I realize this video has already been going on for a while, and I think I've already laid the groundwork to say these are the real, not definitions, because this is beyond definitions. A definition is a simple one-word term that ignores the etymology of words, the sound and profound effects of words on the human psyche, as well as how that's even processed individually or collectively. But I think what I was saying was that the extroverted world is oriented in such a way that it can never stay together in the way that its own survival demands that it needs stay together, right? That there are periods of coming together and coming apart. And then what's unreal is to keep the inauthentic forms of relations alive past their expiry date. So through all of history and culture, we see where whole cultures, whole peoples, whole modes of life are permanently changed, altered, taken over, died off, whatever it is. But that if human beings are alive into the future, there's going to be a larger case study than ever, not just on how these things have played out in the world, but also on all present actions and inactions that you can see therein. Because I was discussing this from the idea that the individual is a unique phenomenon and is a production of ancestral memory in the form of genetics, right? That however they choose to engage and relate to the world then speaks the real truth, the real vibe, the real confession of the human psyche Is their association? Is what they choose? Did they go for the prefabricated answer? Did they believe what they were told? Did they believe what they were conditioned? Did they think for themselves, right? This is, right, and I'm not, right, this is beyond praise and blame. This is beyond morality, because morality is a construct within the whole psychological warfare of types that's been played out through all of history here, which again, the larger tendency, if people are curious why a lot of dumb people are so superstitious, especially when it comes to smart people, it's because they do see intelligence as a threat. Like what an intelligent animal learns to understand is that other intelligent animals are threats. So even within the dumbest people, you will find the cultural paranoia, because I was also saying that Jung makes it sound quaint as if these are choices, rather than the whole human endeavor and the social nature of it being fatal, meaning for all of human history, for people to be themselves would cost them their life or their sanity or any kind of freedom therein, because they would be committed to asylums or prisons or whatever it is about their nature, whether that's vital and violence, or what violent in degrees of like Socratic psychological violence, or basic brute dumb Achilles-like violence, that regardless is an expression of the same male tendency. And it is the human ego, which, like I said before, you can see is a further case study. Look at the difference between Eastern and Western culture, right? Which one sounds more insane? Which one looks more stable and balanced? Which one seems more actually wholesome and nurturing to anything that might resemble human consciousness, human heart, human soul? I'm not saying the East is superior, not at all, because the West was so superior that it dominated the world to the point that even English here is lingua franca. But even English can't make up for the fact that these are a bunch of phenomes that are meaningless in and of themselves and only have any sensible meaning when heard by a group of people who understand the context and definitions and etymologies. And all this is just assumed and taken for granted. Again, that people, when they even use language, that their evaluating standpoints are the same, and therefore their language is oriented the same, right? The complications and the blindness we as types have to one another are endless, right? So it really is complex, but I was just pointing out that the whole human endeavor has been a fatal dancing around what psychological types are, what the human is, what the pre-human was, what the previous human was, what the existing human was, and then speculation on what the better human of tomorrow will be. So anyway, the good news about humanity, the best thing about man, is he's a bridge and not a goal. So I'm going to go on ahead and continue these talks here on psychological types. I think next time I will do the conscious and or unconscious attitudes of introverts and extroverts, and from there I'll launch further into just what these mutations are and what this subspecies divide is. Before I get rambling off in the weeds again, I appreciate your time, and I hope wherever this finds you, it finds you well. So thanks again, and I'll catch you on the next one maybe. Take care.